It was always just before midnight when he walked in. The bell above the cafe door would tinkle softly, breaking the quiet hum of the old espresso machine, and for a moment, the small place would feel different, like the air had shifted. He never stayed long, never ordered more than a black coffee, no sugar, no cream. Always the same table in the corner, always the same faint nod toward the barista before sinking into silence. To most, he was just another late-night customer, maybe a workaholic who needed caffeine to push through the night. But to Emma, who worked the closing shift, he was a puzzle she didn't have the energy to solve. Life had left her too tired for mysteries. Yet, night after night, there he was, watching the rain drip against the windows, his hands wrapped around the mug like it was the only warmth he had left in the world. She didn't know yet that he was the CEO of one of the largest companies in the city, or that he was a single father whose heart carried the weight of loneliness no money could cure. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and stories that remind us how a small act can change someone's life, please like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel, Stories Collection. Your support helps us keep bringing these emotional stories to life. Emma's life was a collection of small battles. Her days started with the alarm clock that jolted her awake at 6 a.m., the scramble to get her 7-year-old daughter, Lily, ready for school, the constant juggle between bills and tips from the cafe, and the ache in her back that never went away. She had learned not to expect much from life. Surviving was enough. The cafe was her second home, faded wallpaper, old wooden counters polished by decades of hands, and the faint aroma of coffee beans that clung to her clothes. It was the kind of place where the regulars were family, and strangers were rare. He was an exception. The first night she saw him, she thought maybe he was lost, or just passing through. But then he came back. And again, and again. He spoke little, yet his presence was impossible to ignore. His suit was always immaculate, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes were tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day, but the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for years. Emma sometimes caught him staring at the window like he was looking for something out there, something he had lost. She wondered what his story was but never asked. Customers came for coffee, not confession. Still, she noticed things. How he'd leave a generous tip without saying a word. How his hands would linger around the mug like the heat grounded him. How sometimes, his phone would ring, and he'd glance at it before silencing it without answering. What Emma didn't know was that his name was Daniel Carter, and he was the man behind Carter Enterprises, a name plastered on billboards, magazines, and the news. He was used to boardrooms, investment meetings, and the relentless noise of success. But lately, his life felt hollow. His wife had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving him to raise his 9-year-old son, Ethan, alone. The house they lived in was big, far too big for just the two of them, and filled with echoes of a voice they'd never hear again. Daniel buried himself in work during the day, but at night, when the silence became too much, he found himself wandering the city. That's how he found Emma's cafe. The place reminded him of simpler times, of Saturday mornings when his wife would drag him to little coffee shops just because she liked the smell of fresh pastries. Here, no one cared who he was. No one asked for a deal or a signature. Here, he was just a man with a cup of coffee. And Emma, though she didn't know it, became the reason he came back. She never tried to impress him, never rushed to please him. She simply served the coffee, offered a soft smile, and let him be. It was a relief. Over the weeks, Daniel noticed details about her too. The way her smile didn't always reach her eyes. The way her hands moved quickly, almost anxiously, as if every second mattered. The way she'd sometimes glance toward the clock like she was counting down until she could go home. One rainy night, he saw her daughter sitting in the corner, coloring quietly while Emma worked. Something about the sight, a little girl content with a worn notebook and a pack of crayons, hit him harder than expected. He thought of Ethan, alone at home with the nanny, waiting for him to return. The nights passed, and without realizing it, they started to exchange small words. Good evening, here, stay warm out there, there. He didn't tell her who he was, and she didn't pry. But one night, when the storm outside turned the streets into rivers, she poured his coffee and, without thinking, slid a blueberry muffin onto the saucer. On the house, she said quietly. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before taking the first bite. It was the first thing in weeks that tasted like comfort. Slowly, something shifted. He started coming earlier so he could see Lily before she went to sleep in the corner booth. Sometimes he'd bring her little things, a packet of stickers, a tiny book, a chocolate bar, and Emma would protest, but he'd just smile and say it was nothing. For him, it wasn't nothing. For him, it was a way to feel human again. Months passed, and Emma began to notice that on the nights Daniel came in, the cafe felt warmer, lighter somehow. She found herself looking forward to that bell ringing above the door. She didn't know why, but she felt safe when he was around. Like he saw her, not just the tired barista, but the woman behind the apron. And then one night, everything changed. A drunk customer stumbled in just before closing, angry and loud. He started shouting about his order, knocking over chairs. Emma tried to calm him, but he slammed his hand on the counter, making Lily flinch. Before Emma could react, Daniel was there. His voice was low but firm, his presence commanding without being aggressive. The man left, grumbling, and Emma stood frozen, heart pounding. Daniel simply looked at her and said, "No one should speak to you like that." Then he left without finishing his coffee. She didn't see him for a week. And when he finally returned, he looked different. Determined. That night, he stayed until closing and asked her how she was. She almost told him everything, about the bills, the long hours, the fear of not being enough for her daughter, but she just said, "I'm fine." He didn't push. What she didn't know was that Daniel had already decided something. 2 days later, the cafe owner called her in early. There was a man there, Daniel, talking quietly with the owner. The moment she walked in, the conversation stopped. The owner handed her an envelope and said she was getting a raise and fewer night shifts. Emma didn't understand until she saw Daniel's small smile. "Just thought you deserved a little kindness," he said, and walked out before she could reply. It was only months later, when a news report showed Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises, standing on a stage at a charity gala, that Emma realized who he was. And suddenly, everything made sense. The generosity, the quiet strength, the sadness in his eyes. From then on, things were different, but not in the way she feared. He still came for coffee. He still sat at the same table. But now, sometimes, Ethan came with him, and the four of them, Daniel, Ethan, Emma, and Lily, would share quiet evenings. Filled with warmth that had nothing to do with coffee. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to Stories Collection, and share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Your engagement helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life. Special request: tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone who changed your life without even trying? Alright, I can expand this into the full 6,000 word cinematic flow you asked for, deepening Daniel's backstory, Emma's struggles, the emotional turning points, and adding more slow burn connection between them so the audience really feels the transformation. Here's the extended continuation and enrichment from where we left off, keeping that warm, late-night cafe atmosphere alive. Emma couldn't stop thinking about it. The name, the suit, the way he carried himself, it all made sense now. She replayed every moment in her head. The first night he came in dripping from the rain, the quiet nods, the way his eyes softened when Lily handed him a drawing. All those nights, she'd served coffee to a man whose face was on magazine covers and whose company name loomed from skyscrapers, and yet, here in the cafe, he was simply Daniel. She wondered why he never said anything. Why he hid in plain sight. And then it struck her, maybe he came here because it was the one place where no one asked anything of him. No boardroom demands, no endless meetings, no investors breathing down his neck. Just coffee, rain, and silence. The next time he came in, she didn't mention the news story. She simply handed him his coffee and, for the first time, sat down across from him during a quiet spell. She didn't ask about his company or his money. Instead, she asked about Ethan. His face lit up in a way she hadn't seen before. He spoke about his son with pride and a hint of guilt, how Ethan loved soccer, how he was funny in unexpected ways, how Daniel wished he could be around more. Emma listened, sipping her tea, thinking how strange it was that this man, who could buy anything, still craved the simplest thing of all, time with the people he loved. That winter was colder than usual. The cafe's heater sputtered and groaned, barely keeping the chill away. Emma wore 2 sweaters under her apron, and Lily kept a scarf around her neck even indoors. One especially bitter night, Daniel arrived carrying 2 large paper bags. Inside were a new, thick coat for Lily and a pair of leather gloves for Emma. She tried to protest, but he only said, "Consider it an early Christmas." Emma's throat tightened as she thanked him. It wasn't just the gift, it was the thought. He had noticed. By February, Daniel's visits had become a part of her life's rhythm. Some nights he'd bring Ethan, who quickly became inseparable from Lily. The 2 children would sit in the corner booth, whispering conspiracies over hot chocolate, their laughter breaking up the quiet hum of the cafe. Other nights, Daniel came alone, and Emma found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone, about Lily's father who had left before she was born, about the years of scraping by, about the constant fear of losing the little stability she had. Daniel never pitied her. He never offered empty platitudes. He just listened, really listened, like her words mattered. And in return, he shared pieces of his own grief, how losing his wife had broken him, how some nights he sat in his car outside Ethan's school, not ready to face the empty house. Somewhere along the way, without realizing it, they had begun to heal each other. One late March evening, the city lost power in a sudden blackout. The cafe went dark except for the candles Emma lit on each table. Daniel arrived minutes later, and instead of coffee, they shared a pot of tea. The flicker of candlelight softening the sharp edges of the world outside. The children huddled under a blanket in the corner, whispering ghost stories, while Emma and Daniel sat in quiet conversation. It was the first time Emma noticed how gentle his smile was when he wasn't hiding behind the weight of his own thoughts. But life, Emma knew, had a way of testing happiness. In April, the cafe owner announced he was selling the place. The rent was too high, and business too slow. Emma felt the ground shift under her feet. This job wasn't just her income, it was her anchor, the place where she had built a life around her daughter's needs. Losing it meant starting over again, something she didn't know if she had the strength to do. Daniel noticed her change in mood before she told him. One night, as she refilled his cup, he said softly, "What if it didn't have to close?" She laughed bitterly, assuming he was being kind. But 2 weeks later, the owner told her the cafe had been bought, and the new owner wanted to keep everything, and everyone, exactly as it was. She didn't need to ask who it was. The first night under new ownership, Daniel walked in just like he always had, sat in his usual corner, and nodded toward the counter. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything had. By summer, their evenings had turned into something Emma never expected. They would close the cafe together, sometimes walking out into the warm night air with the children in tow, getting ice cream from the cart down the street. It was slow, unspoken, but the connection between them deepened in ways neither dared to name. One night in July, a sudden downpour caught them as they left. The four of them ran laughing through the rain, soaked to the bone by the time they reached Daniel's car. Emma could still hear Lily's giggles mixing with Ethan's, the warm sound of life where once there had only been loneliness. It was in that moment, standing there dripping in the glow of the streetlight, that Emma realized something. Daniel hadn't just been coming for the coffee. He had been coming for them. If you want, I can now carry this into the last, most emotional act where Daniel finally confesses why he kept coming, how their two broken lives merge, and end with a deeply moving finale that will keep YouTube viewers hooked until the very last second. That's where I can also place the final emotional call to action before the special request comment prompt. Do you want me to continue into that final, tear-jerking resolution now?